Thank you very much for joining us. You had been a young man when this story broke and shocked the nation.
Well, I helped break the story, actually, as a reporter for the Mirror. I guess I was 29. That's how I became a writer, because I wrote a best-selling book about it 25 years ago. So it kind of changed my life, actually. It's just one of those big stories that fell into my lap. And I've been making TV programs, and that book's been selling for a quarter of a century.
It's remarkable, Howard. So tell me how this story came to your attention.
Well, originally I simply had a tip-off that there was an ongoing police investigation in Gloucester in 94. This is 1994. That's how long ago it is. And I was told that there was far more to it than the public and the press knew, that it was a house full of human remains. We used that terrible journalist cliche, a house of horrors, which we dreamt up very unoriginal phrase on the day. It was a front page story, and that was the start of, I didn't dream I'd still be talking about it all these years later.
Yeah.
But it's an exceptionally unusual murder case. It's very, very unusual, and that has made it of enduring public interest.
So did you encounter Fred West?
I saw him in court, and of course I covered Rose West's trial. And then of course Fred West killed himself before the trial took place. So I saw him at what they call a remand appearance, which was really the only place you could see him, unless you were in the interview room with him.
And can you tell me about how it was to report on this awful story at the time? I mean, it must have been pretty traumatic.
Well, everyone always says that to me, and I have to tell you, counterintuitively, it was very exciting. If you're a journalist or a writer, you want a story to tell, and you want a story that is powerful and compelling, and you want to have good access. And if you have those things, you're carried along with it, like you jump on a train and it keeps going. And it's actually exciting. And that's what motivates journalists, and it's what motivates non-fiction writers if you write non-fiction books. So I didn't have time to get depressed by it. As I've got older, I'm now in my 50s. When all this started, I was in my 30s. I'm a much older person, I'm more contemplative about the story, and I've got to know many of the families involved, and there's been an enormous amount of damage caused, not just to the people who died, but the many people who are related to the people who died, and there are missing people unaccounted for. There's a lot. There's the family of the Wests, the children. There's been a great deal of damage there.
Yeah. So can you remind us of their crimes?
Well, in a nutshell, what's really unusual about the Wests and why we're talking about them is that they're a husband and wife serial killing team. Now, most murderers are men. Most serial killers are men. Women very rarely murder, and women serial killers are as rare as hen's teeth. A husband and wife serial killing pair who do it for fun, for their own gratification. Well, there isn't another example in British criminal history I can think of. The closest you would get to that would be Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. Now, by comparison, Hindley and Brady killed 5 children in the 1960s over a three-year period. Fred and Rose West killed between them at least 12 young women and children over from 1967 until 1987, and they may well have killed more. And what is doubly weird about it is that they buried many of the victims under their own home, which is a sort of nondescript semi-detached house in the middle of Gloucester. 25 Cromwell Street was the address. And these victims included their own teenage daughter, Heather. And that's how the whole thing started in 1994, because the police were looking for Heather, a teenage girl who went missing, and there was no record of where she'd gone, and she wasn't on any kind of database. And her siblings were telling the police and care workers that there was a family joke that, in fact, Dad had killed Heather and buried her under the patio in the back garden. This was a sort of dark joke within the household. And a very tenacious policewoman called Hazel Savage, she decided to push to investigate this, which resulted in a search warrant. And they dug the back garden up, and lo and behold, they found Heather, and they found a lot more besides.
So it's possible that they might have got away with it.
Well, they did get away with it they got away for 2 decades, 2.5 decades. I mean, it's an extraordinary story. This house, they had lodgers in this house, so it was a busy house. There were lots of people living there, and in fact, the police would visit frequently to do drugs raids. And yet, apparently, nobody noticed that Fred and Rose were killing young girls and children, and they were dismembering their bodies and burying them in the cellar.
So, do you think police incompetence is a big part of the story?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think the actual police investigation, Gloucestershire police investigation, was, pretty good. And the senior investigating officer, John Bennett, had a very difficult job, and he did a very good job when they actually started digging and looking. And they had a hell of a job, really, but they made the most of it. I mean, of course, in retrospect, it seems amazing that Fred West and Rose West, and of course, you must always remember it's a duo. It's not just Fred West, it's Fred and Rose. Hence, that's why the book's called Fred and Rose. They're in it together, they're killing together. It's part of what turns them on. Seems amazing they did it for all those years. It's an example of murder in plain sight. It's, who would think that the couple at the end of the road, and Fred was a very genial, friendly, well-known local guy, who'd have thought that they were a couple of serial killers?
And what do we know about the nature of their relationship, explored, of course, in capacious detail in your book, Fred and Rose? What was the dynamic of their relationship, Howard?
It's hard to know because, of course, like all maniac murderers, they didn't tell the truth. Fred was interviewed at great length and he spoke endlessly, but his interviews aren't really coherent. And Rose more or less went no comment. But essentially, Fred West was sexually depraved. He was sadistic. He was a voyeur. He was obsessed with pornography and prostitution. And they had this kind of sordid, disgusting marriage. I mean, it's a truly sordid case, whereby Rose was a prostitute and Fred would watch her with other men. She was excited by violence against women and violent lesbian encounters with young girls. And he essentially appears to have been the voyeur who would watch. And then there would be various obscene, there was bondage. Bondage was a big part of it. I mean, not bondage in the kind of plastic handcuff sense, but sort of bondage until you die type stuff.
And what about the power dynamic? Was there a dominant figure within that partnership?
Well, Fred was considerably older than Rose, and he'd killed before they met. So surely he was in charge initially. And Rose was only 15 years old when they met, and he was 27. But I think over time, that changed. Rose came into her own. Rose had a vicious temper, a hair trigger, crazy temper, would just go nuts, attack people, stab, throw things, went crazy. And I think she became, if anything, the more aggressive one of the two. It's very hard to know because, of course, only they know, only Fred and Rose know. Fred killed himself, having given a very contradictory account of what happened. And Rose has insisted all these years that she knew nothing about it. And she's innocent. I mean, she would say, if you had her on your show from HM Prison, New Hall, she would say, I'm innocent, Gov. I didn't do it. It was all Fred. I was out. I know nothing about it. So you have to kind of like all. I mean, the thing about murder cases like this is the people involved don't tell the truth, so you have to somehow make sense of it from all sorts of different sources.
And she appears to have tried to reinvent herself and her image within prison.
Well, I mean, she has this kind of life in prison whereby she knits and watches Strictly Come Dancing, and she cooks, and you know, I've made TV programs where I've spoken about that. So she appears to be a very homely person. But of course, she's a serial killer, and she's a maniac, and she's a vicious, terrible person, and she's in denial. And indeed, the most wicked thing of all, actually, is that she knows really what happened. She knows where people like Mary Bastholm are, who's another likely victim, whose remains have never been found. Even if she didn't kill her herself, Fred surely told her what he did to Mary in 1968. It's a great unsolved case. But of course, she won't help. She won't talk about it. And I really wish the Gloucestershire police, they reopened their investigation for us making this ITV show, and they dug up this cafe in Gloucester where Mary worked. We've just made a big documentary about that. I wish that they would now go and try and engage with Rose in Newhall Prison and try to talk to her in the way that the police spoke to Myra Hindley in the 80s. And after 20 years of denying it, if you recall, Myra Hindley changed her story and actually said, yes, I was involved and there are more victims and I'll help you find them. And that's how the police found Pauline Reed, the first Moors murder victim. And Rose West could do that if she wanted to in any way atone for what she did. But she's a very difficult person to engage with because she's in that terrible psychobabble phrase, she's in denial.
For sure. Now, of course, your book is a bestseller. It's out now. Fred and Rose, a fascinating tome indeed, and perhaps the definitive account of this awful story. Tell me about the documentary.
Well, we've just made reopened, Fred and Rose West reopened. Trevor McDonald is the presenter, and it was broadcast last week over 2 nights. And of course, you can watch it on Catch Up. And you know, lots of people can still, you can watch it. It hasn't disappeared, but it was broadcast last week, and it's a 2-part documentary about Fred and Rose West's other victims, people like Mary Bastholm. Where are they? And as I say, Gloucestershire Police, if you remember, in the summer, they actually went and reopened and started digging at a cafe in Gloucester, where we had a search team with sniffer dogs, and we thought there was a lead there to possibly finding her remains. But there are other places too. There are other locations which we investigate, and I'm in the program. I'm one of the producers, and I'm in the program, and I go to locations with the team where we think there may be other victims.